So let's have a look at those stages in more detail. So slide number 27, the origin of news. Now the thing about news, when you speak to journalists, and I did this for my PhD, and I asked them the very simple question, I said, where does your news come from? How do you decide what stories to cover? And here's a tip for you: if you're going to interview journalists or any other professional, try and keep the question as short and as simple as possible. Where does news come from? Where do you get it from? It's only 5 or 6 words. But most journalists, when I asked them that, they kind of went, wow, whoa, never really thought about it. And yet it's fundamental to their job. And the example I've chosen here, this is a photograph I took many years ago on Brighton Beach. If anybody knows Brighton Beach, you know that it's not sandy, it's actually got loads of pebbles on it. And the reason I took this picture was because that orange pebble stood out. This is the crazy sort of photographs I take. And I thought that was really analogous to the world and journalism in general. So why? Imagine that each of those pebbles represents a story. Why, out of all those thousands, millions, billions of pebbles on Brighton Beach, why would the journalist choose that orange one? And the key point is that there are literally millions, if not billions, of stories available every day. And yet, every news programme, like BBC News, half-hour news, typically they have 10 items. So they've chosen 10 out of 1 billion, let's say, or 1 million. And that process is fascinating. Really, really fascinating as to why journalists do it. And the other interesting thing about it, moving on, is that all journalists, believe it or not, tend to choose the same stories. Now, if you don't believe me, invest a bit of time tonight, watch BBC News at 6 o'clock, watch Channel 4 News at 7 o'clock, and if you've got it, watch Sky News. So just choose 3 British broadcasters, and I will bet you, even though I shouldn't bet you real money, I'll bet you £1 that most of the stories that those news organisations choose are exactly the same. And which you think, well, that makes sense because they're important, but not really, because the world has got an infinite choice of stories. So what happens is that journalists tend to copy each other. They tend to follow what other organisations are doing. And if you've ever been to a newsroom, you'll notice that they actually have screens on the wall. So that in the BBC newsroom, they will have a screen with Channel 4 News on it and Sky News. They want to know what the competition are doing. And if they have a story on Sky News that the BBC don't have, the BBC boss will get annoyed at the journalist. Why didn't you get that story? So journalism, bizarrely, for in a world of choice and unlimited options, it's incredibly repetitive. And that's what the academic studies find as well. That's not just opinion, that is the academic studies. And one of the problems you have when you study journalism as an academic is you come into conflict with journalists. And this is the main reason why. Slide number 28. Journalists believe that they discover news and they report the facts. So they honestly believe that they have found a story and then they report just simply the facts. And you think about it, the terminology, they call it the news, the definite article, the news, here is the news. What they should really say is, here is some news. So what academics actually argue is that journalists make the news, and journalists really hate that when you say that they make news, because make kind of implies that they're inventing it. But we don't really mean that, we're just meaning they construct it, and I'll come on to that in a few moments. And they, instead of reporting the facts, they reproduce selective information. And again, we'll come on to that. But that's what academics will say to journalists, which is why journalists sometimes get upset with us. So the question at the bottom, if the academics are correct, can news help us make sense of the world beyond our personal experience? Can we make informed consumer, political or life choices? Can our normative expectation that it's accurate, true and fair be satisfied? So those two definitions there, those two statements, what journalists believe and what academics believe, there's quite a lot of conflict in there, isn't it? Which is, kind of uncomfortable to a point, but it's also really, really good if you want to do research. Let's move on to the next slide. I'll give you some examples of how academic research works. Now, two of the most famous academic researchers in the world, really, are these two. I think they're Norwegian, Galtung and Rouge, way back 1965. They identified 12 factors that are important to the selection of news. So this goes back to my picture of the beach with the orange pebble. So that's a metaphor for how journalists choose news. So what Galton and Rouge found is the frequency, how often it happens. In other words, there's a certain threshold. It needs, and it's a really bad thing to say, but a small earthquake that only kills one person doesn't really generate news. If it's a big earthquake that kills 1,000, that is news. So there's a threshold of tragedy, if you like. It's a sad example, but it's true. Unambiguity, so it definitely happened, and this is what the score was in a football match, for example. If there's a debate in the House of Commons that wasn't really that entertaining and there was no vote at the end, that's probably not going to be news. If it was a big vote and 50% of people disagree with Boris Johnson, then that is a big story. Meaningfulness, it has to mean something to the audience. So they came up with all these factors that determine whether news has a value or not. And then there was another study in 1979 by Golding and Elliott, and they extended, this is the standing on the shoulders of giants I spoke about, they extended Galton and Rouge's work, Harkup and O'Neill 2001, and they took it even further by talking about things like the power elite, and that's something I found with my research. The power elite, business people, politicians, royal family, celebrities even, they automatically have more potency as a news story than anybody else. Classic example here. Do you remember when Kate Middleton had a baby, or when Meghan Markle had a baby a couple of years ago? Front page news, But the point is, it's a woman having a baby. That happens all the time. That happens on on an hourly basis all over the world. But because those people are royalty, they are seen to be celebrities and the power elite. So them having a baby is news. You or I having a baby, well, it'd be news if I had a baby, because that's man has baby. But if your family had a baby or my family had a baby, it wouldn't be news. So the way that they do it, these academics, they analyse hundreds, literally thousands of articles, and they analyse what it is that the story is. Why is this a story and something else is not a story? Think about my example earlier. The royal family being they are privileged. They get an incredible amount of money, public money. They have loads and loads of estates and properties and all that stuff, but that's never questioned by the media. So, that is not deemed to be a reasonable story, but other stories are deemed to be. So there is a selection process. This is a human process. Somebody somewhere is making decisions about what goes on the news. It's not an accident. It's not an accident. Let's move on. 31. So the origin of news, when you look, again, this comes from my PhD, when you look at where the news actually comes from, it comes from a surprisingly small number of sources. You have news agencies, the famous ones being Reuters, Bloomberg, Press Association. So these are journalists scattered all over the world. They have what you call patches or beats. So there'll be a West African correspondent for Reuters, and he or she will be looking out for stories in West Africa. He or she will then write those stories up and sell them literally to the BBC or to CNN or whoever. Government and business, there's a lot of, and it's scheduled news. We know in advance that a company like Facebook is going to report its results on April the 1st. So that will be a story that's in the diary. That's going to happen. Government, elections, debates, the budget, all that sort of thing. Public relations, very, very, very active sector of society, of public PR people. Their job is to present a positive image of government, business, celebrity. They are working behind the scenes to get newspapers, magazines, TV stations, radio stations to say positive things about their clients. It's all behind the scenes. It's all a bit glamorous. I used to be a public relations person. It's all a bit sinister at times because what you're trying to do is manipulate people's opinion. And the point is, when you look at journalism, the origin of news, there is actually very little discovery. So examples of where a journalist has, dug around and asked questions and being inquisitive, the classic investigative journalist, that you see on movies, that is actually very, very, very rare when you look at the origin of stories. And if you want a book on this, and it's a depressing book, but it's a brilliant book, Nick Davis, Flat Earth News, published in 2008. And he looks at the origin of news in great detail. He was a Guardian journalist for many years. And this is exactly what Nick found. I think 60% of news actually comes from public relations, which is quite depressing. And again, when you tell that to journalists, they absolutely hate it because they have this idea that they are inquisitive and they find news. And the phrase that Davis uses is the echo chamber. One journalist says it, then another journalist follows the story up, and then a third journalist follows that story up, And before you know it, all journalists are saying the same thing. Classic example here, folks, tragic example. Do you remember weapons of mass destruction? Maybe you're a bit too young to remember that. 17, 18 years ago, the British media and the American media was convinced that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, primarily because that's what their governments told them. And then, lo and behold, we went to Iraq, invaded Iraq. A load of innocent people died in the process. A load of American and British soldiers were injured and died in the process. No weapons of mass destruction, you know. But the point is that the security services or whoever, I'm still not quite sure who, but they perpetuated this myth, weapons of mass destruction, and it just echoed around the chamber. And before you know it, the United States and Britain were invading Iraq, and all the problems that have followed since then. News providers tend to follow the same stories. Again, you say that to a journalist and they'll be disappointed because they like to think they have their own stories, but they do tend to repeat and follow up the same ones. Second point is sources. Sources. Here's the guy who looks a little bit offended, leaning back away from the microphone. How dare you ask me that question? So a source, a source basically is somebody who provides information. A source is somebody who is quoted in an article who appears on a broadcast news piece as an interviewee. And sources obviously are really, really, really important. As Judson says at the top there, sources are a defining factor because the relationship between a journalist and their sources determines the substance of news. So for example, if you're talking about education, right, the education problems in the UK. So think about how the story would be different. If you speak to the Education Secretary, I've forgotten who it is, but the MP who is the Education Secretary, he or she is going to give you a different story to, say, a single mum who lives in South London who's got 3 kids at the local comprehensive school. They are going to give you 2 different answers to exactly the same question. So you can ask them is, you know, what is the state of education in the UK? The minister is going to give a very different answer to the single mum from South London. So the source is really, really, really important. The other point about sources is that journalists tend to gravitate to the same sources. And again, in my PhD, I thought I discovered something, and when I mentioned it to my professor, he said, well, you've just confirmed every other empirical study before you. And what I confirmed is that politicians and business people dominate. So the vast majority of people who are interviewed in serious journalism, on TV, in newspapers, on the radio, tend to be politicians and business people. And you might think, well, they have a lot of knowledge. They do, but what about the rest of us? What about the rest of us? And incidentally, in academia, they are known as the primary definers. And a rather sobering statistics underneath there, the proportion of general news in UK newspapers composed wholly or mainly from PR and or Newswire, that's Reuters, Bloomberg, is estimated at 60%. In the United States, the equivalent figure, around about the same, is between 40 and 70%. And the comment on the right-hand side, and this is something which touches me greatly because political news is really my thing, and I noticed this when I've done my research, is that political news typically, and this is Herbert Gans, who's an American academic, he says, news comes from the public from the top down, typically. So journalists interview politicians, they interview ministers, they interview secretaries of states, they interview political analysts, they also interview, as we found out last week, other journalists, and it's very, very rare that they interview academics or even more so members of the public. Now when there's an election coming up, like there is in the States right now, you will hear, you know, the voice on the streets of of Oklahoma or Arkansas or wherever. They'll shove a microphone under somebody's nose and ask them what they think. But generally speaking, if you analyse news, the vast majority of political comment comes from politicians, political journalists, political analysts, and their citizens' perspective is rarely given. So sourcing, you could, if you wanted to, via the method of content analysis or interviews at the bottom there, you could do a very good piece of research about the sources. Sport reporting, classic example. They typically speak to players and managers. Journalists very rarely speak to the fans or even to the owners of sports clubs, if you look at the data. So there's great potential there to do some research about sources. Source analysis, Yeah, so when you do source analysis, what you're doing is a number of things. You're looking at who is consulted. And if a source is mentioned, then that by extension says that their views are important. Clearly, people whose views are not important are not mentioned. It also tells you, if you look at sources, which ideas are valid, and by extension, which ideas are not. And a really, really key point at the bottom, and you can sort of work this one out sort of by looking at it the other way around, excuse me, whose views are excluded, who is not mentioned in the article. And if you analyse enough articles or enough pieces, you'll notice that patterns start to appear. It's not just an accident that certain groups of people are not mentioned. I'm just going to give you a really, really quick example. And this comes from chapter 3 of my book, The Political Content of British Economic, Business and Financial News. And what this chapter looked at was basically a moment in time. This was the end of November, beginning of December 1999, 20 years ago. And there was a very important conference. At the time, globalization was a really big issue in the news and amongst people in general, the general population. Because what globalization meant is that the typical national boundaries were dissolving. So travel was a lot easier, technology was opening up the world. And on a negative side, from Britain's point of view, a lot of, in the north where I come from, a lot of factories were closing down and the production was being shifted to China and other parts of the world. That was all globalization. So there was a big conference at the end of November 99 to discuss the next stage of globalization. And there were different points of view available. There were also protests, big protests. We've seen protests this year with Black Lives Matter. There were big protests in the streets about globalization in 1999. So the way that I did it, I'll talk more about this in week 6 when I do my BBC session. But the way that I did it, I designed the content analysis first. So I searched articles for any mention of these words: globalization, anti-globalization, World Trade Organization, WTO. I set the period for the period of the conference, and 1 month before and 1 month after. And then I searched the online databases, the BBC News website, The Guardian, and The Times, and I generated a total of 488 articles, 42 variables, 20,000 units of data, 6 months work, etc. Don't worry, you don't have to do this for assessment 1 or assessment 3. This is an example of a PhD chapter. So essentially I'm doing a comparative study. I'm interested to know how 3 news organisations reported the same event at the same time, because that will show you differences in their journalism. So what I expected, this is a good starting point, this is the normative expectation. I expected a full spectrum of debate. Typically, The Guardian, you would expect it to be on the left. So The Guardian, for our American friends, typically like the New York Times. So the Times of London, this one, would typically favour the right, so I guess that would be Wall Street Journal territory. And the BBC, as we know, has this statutory, we were talking about this earlier, statutory obligation to be politically impartial. It should be fair and open-minded when examining the evidence and weighing the material facts. So that's the reason I did this comparative study. The Guardian on the left, the Times on the right, and we would expect the BBC to be in the middle. So my analysis was based on that premise, is that's what we should expect. However, when I did the source analysis, so I analysed 400 and whatever it is articles, and every time I saw a source, I made a note of who he or she was, which organisation they represented, and what their political position probably was. So the Times, look at the blue. So the blue segments of those charts are what you call the elite and business. So you've got the developed world elite in dark blue, that's Europe, North America typically. The developing world elite, that's Africa, South America typically, and some of Asia in light blue. Then you've got the World Trade Organization, and then you've got business representatives. Typically speaking, all of those 4 blue segments, they represent the right of politics, because they all believed in free trade and reducing boundaries. You've got a big section there, or a relatively big section of other sources, academics and so on. And then in red stroke green, these are the critics of the World Trade Organization, and these people were typically called left-wing. So they are organisations like Greenpeace, Oxfam, trade unions, community groups, public intellectuals, authors, and so on. So you would expect the BBC to be somewhere down the middle, to have right-wingers and left-wingers equally represented. But look at the difference. BBC The red-green coalition is about 15%. The blue coalition is about 60%. So a 4-to-1 imbalance between the two. And the BBC is actually more like the Times than it is like the Guardian. People always think the Guardian and the BBC are both liberal. Actually, when you look at the data, the Times and the BBC, or the Telegraph and the BBC, are much more similar. So this is what source analysis can do. It's very enlightening. It can show you, if you like, the political texture of an organisation's reporting. So that's just one example. And like I said, I will go through that in greater detail and give you more examples in week 6. Let's move on, because as always the clock is ticking. The third stage, news production. Now the photograph I've used here might surprise you. It's a photograph, I think, a 1960s car in a factory being made. And yeah, and again, journalists and academics, they don't really have a good relationship, because they get horrified by some of the things that we say. But we don't say them just to be provocative. We say them because that's what our research discovers. And our research, one major finding of our research is this idea that news, just like a car or an iPad, is manufactured. It's made, it's put together, it's pieced together from component parts into a coherent whole. So we talk about the news production process. And let me give you a graphic example, some graphic examples of this. I'll move on to that in a few minutes. But the reason that we talk about, and the phrase I sometimes use is the news factory. You know, the journalists talk about the newsroom, you know, like the BBC newsroom, the Guardian newsroom, but I think it's more like a factory. You don't have all the crashing and banging and the metal and the sparks and the noise of a factory, but it's essentially doing the same thing. On the left hand side there, I've got a list of some of the factors that you see. Resources and staff levels. So they do have resources. Their raw material moving down is the information from the sources, and they get it, some of their information, from Reuters and Bloomberg. That's raw material, just like metal is the raw material of a car, metal and rubber and glass and so on. Journalists have to deal with resources. Newsrooms at these days tend to be quite poorly staffed because there have been so many job losses. Ethics and regulation, obviously there are rules and accepted moral standards about what journalism should be. You've got this concept of house tradition. The Economist newspaper, magazine, for example, is very much committed to libertarianism. That is ever since it was founded in the 19th century, and that continues now. So if there's an issue that comes along, The Economist is usually 9 times out of 10, 99 times out of 100, takes a libertarian position. There are routines in the news factory. You talk to journalists and they say, well, we come in the morning, and then at 10 o'clock we have a morning meeting and we discuss ideas. Morning meetings, they discuss ideas about what the story should be, what's happening in the world. As a big group, they discuss it, and then the editor will say, well, let's do that story and do that one, maybe that one, but we won't do the other one. So there's the routine of sourcing. You know, you ring up your client, your source, and arrange an interview. Editing, these are all routines. They happen on a daily basis, just like in a factory. Then you've got deadlines, airtime, program length, etc., etc. And if you want to analyse how news is made, the way to do it is to watch and interview journalists. So there have been some classic studies in the past, and I was kind of tempted to do something like this for my PhD, but then I realised how long it would take and how, I hate to say this, but how boring it would be. But literally, Jeremy Tunstall, 1971, he sat in newsrooms in the 70s for days, weeks on end, and just literally sat and watched journalists at work and asking questions about why they're doing what they're doing. Jackie Harrison, she did something similar in 2000 with terrestrial TV news, and Alistair Hetherington in the 80s. And there are some classic American ones as well. There's I've forgotten her name. Oh, Gay, G-A-Y-E, Gay Touchman. I'll write it down. But Taylor and Cecily, you might be interested in these. There are a couple of classic American texts. And the other one is, I think it's Herbert Gens. But if you're interested in this, I probably wouldn't recommend it for the assessments for CCTA, because it's a lot of work. But if you're thinking about doing a PhD, then an ethnography can be the way to do it. But remember, it will mean sitting in a newsroom and basically not saying much and just asking a few questions every now and then. So that's stage 3. That's the production of news. You can do it, but I wouldn't recommend it for this. Much better for assessments 1 and 3. I would suggest that you look at the news product. In other words, the news that we see and hear and read, because it's really, really easily accessible. You can do it from the comfort of your own home, and you can get some really, really good results here. So let me throw it back to you. I've put 4 photographs up there. So these photographs, I'll just qualify it by saying that when these events happened, these were the typical images. These were the typical images that you saw on TV and saw in the newspapers. So without jumping ahead, tell me what's happening. What's your interpretation? You may have seen things like this. You may have seen it in documentaries. Anybody, just use your skill and judgment. What's happening?
It's like a strike.
Yeah, who said that? Cecily, yeah?
Yeah, there's garbage everywhere, so probably in between the state and the people who...
Right, let me give you a little bit of a clue. You're on the right track, Cecily, but let me give you a bit of a clue. I don't know, maybe it's a generational thing, but look at the car in the top left. How old do you think that car is? It's a clue. Look at people's fashions and look at cars, and that if you see a photograph, you don't know how old it is, you can sometimes get clues. You're not a million miles away, Cecily. And it's the UK. At the same time, Cecily, in the States, American cars were like 3 times as big as that one. I don't know whether you, before your time, but your parents will tell you, in the 70s and 80s, cars were like the size of tennis courts in the States, right? Oh, here's another angle on it. The photograph in the bottom right, and Cecily says garbage in the streets, or rubbish as we call it. This is going to shock you. That is actually Leicester Square in central London. Leicester Square for a period was absolutely full of garbage. Okay, so Kate's guessed at the 60s or 70s. Right, I'll put you out of your misery, folks. That is actually, it's got a name, this period. You may have heard of it. It's sometimes called, and you hear it on the news quite whenever these things come up. Next slide. It's called the Winter of Discontent. And it was 1978, 79. It's a period, actually, I remember quite well, because as you know, I'm very old. So I smiled when Cecily said it was a long time ago, but I actually remember it. It's okay, Cecily, I won't hold it against you. So Winter of Discontent, 78, 79. And whenever that period is mentioned, those are the photographs that are thrown up, typically. And this is what we call the media narrative. So if this is where my intellectual interest is at the moment. I'm interested in economic and social history. So this period and how it was reported is really fascinating to me. Now this is the media narrative. Watch out for it. If you hear a documentary, you see a documentary about that period in the UK, it's always the same story. And the media narrative said it was a terrible period. As Cecily mentioned, you got people on strike. Yeah, public sector workers in particular. The dead were unburied, rubbish on the streets. That's what the media narrative says, right? And it sounds awful, doesn't it? It sounds like a post-apocalyptic world. The dead are unburied, the rubbish on the streets. Imagine Sylvester Stallone appearing in a minute or something. Britain, the narrative says, was gripped by strikes. Unemployment was rising. Law and order was breaking down. Something had to change. And then along on a golden horse came Margaret Thatcher. She was elected in 1979 and she transformed Britain. And that's what you call a media narrative. And that is a narrative in general because you read it in books, you see it in documentaries. The Conservative Party and the Labour Party, to an extent, they will repeat that narrative. So that is basically a story, a narrative, a way of making sense of the world. And that's something which journalists at the time, they perpetuated and they reinforced and they encouraged. However, and it's an enormous however, my memory of the 70s, and you probably guess how old I am, but I was about 14, 15 at that time. I remember the 70s pretty well. My mum remembers the 70s pretty well. Other people of that age remember the 70s pretty well. Our memory of the 70s, there was an element of what it says there with a media narrative, but there was also another narrative. Now this narrative is equally true. However, this narrative, you hardly ever hear it or read it in journalism. The reason that people were striking, it wasn't because they were belligerent communists, right? It wasn't because people were lazy that they go on strike. I remember it well because inflation at the time was 20%. Your generation doesn't really know what inflation is because we haven't had it for the last 20 years. Inflation of 20%, what it means is that in January the 1st, 1978, your shopping basket of food costs £100. January the 1st, 1979, a year later, it's £120. The reason we had inflation was because in the 70s we had two massive oil price shocks. The price of oil went up by a factor of 4 in 1973. Our American friends, you might want to mention this to your folks. Ask them about the price of gas in the 70s and they all tell you the story. It went up by a factor of 4. So instead of $1 a gallon, it went up to $4 a gallon. That had a massive knock-on effect on the rest of the economy and it caused inflation to go up to 20%. If you're on a fixed income, like most public sector workers are, you want a 20% pay rise, don't you? That's not being greedy, that's just to stand still. And the government were saying, no, we can't give any more. So eventually people got frustrated and there were mass strikes. So that throws a very different light on things. But if you don't explain the inflation, then you might just think that these people are communists and they're disruptive and they're agitators. Unemployment, believe it or not, in the 70s, they say it was really high. It was actually lower than it was in 2018. It's probably round about what it is pre-COVID. A couple of other things, and your generation knows this because it's something which frustrates you greatly and understandably. Education was free for everybody. You had your fees paid and you had a maintenance grant as well if you came from low income like my family was. Houses, even in London, were affordable for most people. And people tended to work a standard 40-hour week. These days, employers get more out of you because you've got emails and you have to log on at night and you work at weekends. So employers actually get 50, 60, 70 hours out of you for the same money. So when you look at that alternative narrative, it's quite a different story to the original one, isn't it? But the thing so you've got the dominant narrative, which is even now is perpetuated in the media, and then you've got this alternative narrative. Both of them are true, to a point. Both of them are true, but they are different interpretations of exactly the same event. And that's really, really important when you're doing media research, is to understand that there are different, what's called competing narratives. So let me give you another example here. This is a real, slide number 46. This is a real front page of the Sun newspaper. Believe it or not, this is not a parody, this is not a pastiche, this is not a student being mischievous, this is real. So the story, as you can see there, is that asylum seekers steal the Queen's bird for barbecues. Now, I don't know whether you know this, but every swan, the bird, on the River Thames, for historic reasons, belongs to the Queen. So that's why the Sun is calling it the Queen's bird. And this story basically perpetuated or added to this idea that asylum seekers are bad, evil, threatening, sinister people. So this is one of numerous stories to perpetuate this idea that asylum seekers are coming over here and stealing our jobs and using our health service, and now they're eating our swans, or not even the swans, they're eating our Queen's swans. Now, there's only one slight little problemette with this story. It's not true. And there was a little bit of investigation done here by Tim Dowling. So basically, in blue there, it says, there is no evidence that an Eastern European has ever eaten a British swan, or indeed that these signs were ever posted anywhere. The Sun was roundly criticised in 2003 for this story, which proved to be a curiously factless evocation of a weary urban myth. The potency of that. Even if you don't buy the Sun, you walk past the newsagents on your way to the tube station, you see that headline, the seed is sown in your mind. Even if you're a complete liberal and you have no issue with asylum seekers, even then it still gets you thinking, oh, maybe they do, maybe they are a little bit different. And it's this whole concept of what's called othering. So asylum seekers are not like us because they eat swans, you know. So this is news product. Going back to the original point of this section, news products. Think about how journalists have portrayed the winter of discontent as being a negative thing, with communists on the street and unburied dead people and so on. Think about the alternative narrative. Asylum seekers. There's two narratives, at least two narratives. One, that they are coming here to steal our jobs and claim welfare and eat our swans. There's another narrative which means that they've been persecuted in their own country and they're trying to get away from it, and we as a humane country should welcome them in and try to help them as civilised human beings. So there's more ways of doing that, and again, I come back to, I encourage you, if you're stuck for an idea for assessments 1 and 3, think about this. There's loads of contentious issues out there, and they all have competing narratives. Israel-Palestine, which has been something that's been going on from at least World War II, possibly arguably longer, all the way back to World War One, or even 2,000 years ago. It depends how you look at it, but there has been that's a contentious issue. Strikes. How are strikes represented? Last year we had quite a few strikes on the railway network. Speaking to my friends, I said, well, do you know what the strikes are about? Hardly anybody knew what the strikes were about, but they knew that they were a pain in the ass. And that's because when you look at the news reports typically don't explain why people are on strike. And the people were on strike because the companies were reducing the number of staff, and they were cutting wages. And whenever that happens, you've got every damn right to go on strike. Leave and remain, of course. Somebody mentioned Brexit earlier on, how those issues are portrayed. Nationalising the railways, the royal family. Protests and demonstrations. How the Black Lives Matter protests were reported in the New York Times could be a research project. Or you could do a comparative project, and you can look at 2 newspapers, one which typically support that noble cause and one which is very critical of that noble cause, in which case it wouldn't be a noble cause. So you can do comparative studies. Some really good examples there which you can track down online. Mike Berry's study of the banking crisis on BBC, Justin Schlossberg, this is the one I mentioned earlier about the Jeremy Corbyn. Oh, sorry, the next one is Jeremy Corbyn. And one at the bottom by a strange guy called G.J. Merrill, which is the political content of British and economic financial news. What I will do actually is I put a PDF of my book on Moodle, and you can read it. It is long, but it gives you a good idea of how to do this sort of study. So comparative study, I've mentioned it. So this is a really good idea for dissertations. Comparative studies, they're really good for MA dissertations and BA. But you obviously with an MA you need to set the bar a little bit higher. And the way that you do a comparative study is you compare and contrast the coverage, so the media coverage, the press coverage of an issue, something like Black Lives Matter maybe, a person, Jeremy Corbyn for example, a place, a country, or a city, or an idea, a political idea, nationalising the railway. Votes for 16-year-olds, or nuclear weapons, the royal family, whatever it might be. So you compare the contrast of an issue by 2 different political positions over a set period. So over a month, over a year, over 6 months. Here's some examples. 2 years ago, I had an MA student. She was Norwegian. She was intrigued to know how the British media, news media, portrayed Norway and Norwegians. Very, very simple. She chose 3 publications. She had 2 search words, Norway and Norwegian, and she searched every mention of the word Norway in the Sun, the Guardian and the Telegraph. Every mention of the word Norwegian in those 3 newspapers. She found actually her study was interesting because in one way it was really boring, but in another way it was fascinating. The vast majority of mentions of Norway and Norwegians by the Sun newspaper was sport. More precisely football. So all the Sun's readers' knowledge of Norway and Norwegian is football. That's it. They don't know about the politics, about the economy, about tourism, about the history of Norway at all. It's just those sporting contexts. Kate Middleton and Meghan Markle touched on this last week, so you could do a comparative study of how those 2 people are reported. I'd rather you didn't, because I've read it so many times. But that's your choice at the end of the day. Legalisation of marijuana, that's quite a common subject, particularly in the States these days. In recent years, quite a few individual states have legalised or decriminalised it. It's decriminalised in Canada now, some European countries. It's still officially illegal in the UK, but it is kind of decriminalised. And that was done by one of my students a few years ago. And another very good one is one of my students last year, an undergrad. Her faith is Sikhism, and she was interested. She said to me in one of the tutorials, she said, Sikhs hardly get a mention in the British newspaper. I said, right, test it, find out, let's do it, let's look at it analytically. So she did a search of the word Sikh and Sikhism in various British newspapers, and she produced a very good dissertation as a result of it. So you could do something the same with Muslims or Islam, Catholics or any other faith you could do. Yeah, and likewise, I guess you could do something with ethnicity as well, but it's kind of difficult because there are various different words that people use. So the way that you do it, you might want to make a note of this. There's a wonderful database available at the library called LexisNexis. LexisNexis is a database of pretty much every newspaper article published for the last 100 years. It's an amazing resource. It makes me wonder how we did it before digital. I mean, literally, you had to flick through newspapers, literally, and read every article to find every mention of the word Sikh. So you can look at tabloids on the right. There, they are right-wing tabloids. They perpetuate right-wing ideas. The Sun, the Mail, the Express. There's only one real tabloid on the left, which is the Mirror, and then you've got the so-called quality newspapers, Times, Telegraph, Financial Times on the right, and the Quality on the left, although it's disputable whether the Guardian and Independent are actually on the left. So you can do a comparative study, left versus right, newspapers, tabloids versus quality. There's lots of examples of what you can do here. Let me just race on a little bit because we're running out of time. Oh, let me just show you this example actually. So going back to my book, which is based on my PhD, slide number 5051. So here's again, this is fascinating when you look at the news product, the portrayal in this case of the reformers and protesters. So the people that were on the streets, the protesters at the World Trade Organization conference in 1999, they were typically wanting reform of the World Trade Organization. So what they were asking for, or they wanted more environmental protection for trade rules, they wanted more workers' rights, and they wanted more a better deal basically for developing countries. So they're all what you might call noble causes, typically left-wing causes. Left-wingers traditionally have been interested in the environment, workers' rights, women's rights, LGBT rights. These are all left-wing causes. The right pretty much is all about individualism and profit. I mean, that's typically what right-wing politics, and it's a very simple message, which is why it appeals so much. Do what you want and earn as much money as possible. That's essentially right-wing politics. The left, dare I say, is a little bit more sort of caring, sharing, collective. That's what socialism is all about, right? So the reformers and the protesters, you can see by the sign there, the homemade sign, defend our forests. It says there, WTO hurts poorest, stop exploiting workers. So there, in a nutshell, is some of the messages of the protesters. So what I was looking at, what I was interested in, is how 3 different British news organisations reported exactly the same event. So this is the big protest. All 3 journalists were there. Right now, this is where it really comes home about how journalism can be subjective. You've got 3 journalists looking at the same event. Okay, so the first journalist, this is The Guardian. The Guardian says about this event, it says, as expected, more than 60,000 people marched in carnival spirits, on the conference hall. Environmentalist students and an eclectic array of causes joined steelworkers and dockers to fill the city centre with colour and noise. It sounds like a music festival. It sounds like Glastonbury. It sounds joyous and happy and positive, right? So that's The Guardian. The same event, same day, by the Times. This is how the journalists saw it at the Times. A motley crew of steelworkers, environmentalists, poverty campaigners and feminist witches has succeeded in outwitting the most powerful governments in the world and hijacking the World Trade Organization agenda. Look at the words, hijacking. That's a negative, right? Hijacking. Feminist witches. Never met one in my life personally, but I guess they exist. Feminist witches sounds a bit menacing, doesn't it? You know? Poverty campaigns, we can deal without workers, but motley crew, that's quite an archaic phrase. I mean, like just a rabble, basically. So that's the Times. But there again, thinking about it, you kind of expect that. So the normative expectation, you'd expect The Guardian, being left and liberal, to be quite sympathetic to these causes. And you'd expect the Times, owned by Rupert Murdoch, to be quite negative about these people who essentially threaten the business interests of Rupert Murdoch and his corporate mates. So there's The Guardian on the left, there's the Times on the right. So where would we expect the BBC to be? I'll answer that. It's a rhetorical question. We'd expect the BBC to be in the middle, pretty straightforward and simple, straightforward. This is the BBC. First word, anarchists. There you go. That starts the ball moving, doesn't it? Environmentalists, union members, human rights activists and religious groups have descended on Seattle with a common purpose to protest against the World Trade Organization. Amongst the protesters are Wiccans. I had to look up what a Wiccan was. No idea. What's a Wiccan? Feminist neo-pagan lovers of magic and nature. Again, never met one before, but I'll take your word for it. Who say the WTO values free trade over the goddess. So, I mean, this is shocking. This is the BBC. You would hope and expect the BBC to be really sober and straight down the middle, without pejorative words, without making judgments. But actually, that's worse than the Times interpretation, isn't it? Because there's a sense of ridicule there. What they're doing is they're conflating totally noble causes, environmentalism, human rights, with anarchy. They're conflating it. They're putting it in the same sentence. It's like at school when your teacher says, don't hang around with those boys. That's what they used to say to me, because they're a bad influence on you. So I got compared to these bad boys at school because I hung out with them. I wasn't a bad boy. But it's like the anarchists, they're the bad boys, and they are being conflated with human rights activists. And then it gets into ridicule. Come on, feminist neo-pagan lovers of nature and magic. So the journalist is basically implying, like with a nudge of their elbow, that these are not noble causes at all. This is nonsense. That's what they... And this is the BBC. This is the BBC. You would expect that maybe from the Sun newspaper or the Times or Fox News, but you wouldn't expect it from a noble, august organisation like the BBC. And this is one of the major findings of my PhD, is that the BBC actually is very close in economics and business to reporting like the Times and the Telegraph and other right-wing organisations. We'll talk more about that in week 6, but that is quite shocking. It still shocks me after all these years. Let's talk very briefly, because we're running out of time. Final stage you can look at audiences. So the people that receive and make sense of the news product. So stage 5 could include audience studies. The way that you do it, and it's difficult to do, it's quite straightforward if you're doing a PhD. If you've only got 15,000 word MA dissertation, it's difficult. You need to do big surveys, and I mean big surveys, 600 plus people. Focus groups where you get a small group together and they talk in detail about how they watch news and how they make sense of it, and interviews with individuals about their viewing and listening and watching habits. Audience research, like I said last week, try not to go down that track of assuming that everything everybody hears they believe. That's called the hypodermic syringe version of interpretation of audience. So in other words, you inject this information in people and they believe it. The Nazis used to believe that many years ago, and some American academics perpetuated that idea in the 50s. It's been demolished. It doesn't work. There are basically very many different sub-audiences. If you want a good indication of how audiences are in real life, watch a program called Gogglebox. The Brits in the room may have heard it. Americans, maybe not. Let me write it down for you. Maybe you have something similar in the States. I don't know. Do you, Cecily? You're nodding your head there. You have it, right? So watch Gogglebox, and you'll notice there are families. So the youngsters and the old people, sometimes they react in the same way. Sometimes they react in totally different ways. So people are very, very, very different in terms of how they react to news. People pay attention sometimes. Sometimes you're reading and listening to the news at the same time. You're not really paying attention. Quite often, people consume news that confirms their belief. You'll read a newspaper that just confirms everything you've ever believed, and you won't actually entertain ideas that might challenge it. We all do it to some extent. And the other frightening statistic is, and there have been loads of surveys done on this over the years, politicians, journalists and estate agents, otherwise known in the States as realtors, are the least trustworthy professions on the planet. Journalists, politicians and people who buy and sell houses. Thankfully academics are pretty high, so thanks. But no, journalists are not really trusted, and yet we watch it. We still watch it. We still consume news, even though we don't really trust it. And if you want to do audience research, and just in general, some sources on the right-hand side there for really good data on audience research. So I'm going to finish off, and I apologise for going slightly over time. So there are 5 sociological approaches. I'll give you more in week 6 about my work on the BBC, which typically looks at stage 4. But I would recommend, folks, that if you want to use a sociological approach to news, try and focus on number 4, because for various reasons, it's illuminating, it's quite good fun, it's relatively easy to do from the comfort of your own home, it doesn't involve interviewing people or doing big surveys. And also, if you want to interview journalists, they're very difficult to pin down because they're so busy. obviously. And it took me about a year to interview my 26 journalists, and you don't really have that amount of time. So I would recommend, if you want to go down this track, choose stage 4. And I apologise for going through this quickly. Never seems to be enough time, but thankfully it's been videoed as well, so I'll put the video, it might be at the end of the weekend, because it does involve a little bit of editing. So in summary, let me just finish off, and then if there's any questions, we can have those. So if you want to take a sociological approach, you're strongly advised to look at stage 4, the representation of people, groups or political ideas. I gave you some examples. Methodologically pretty straightforward, and it can be extremely rewarding and very revealing. If you are tempted, choose a subject, the media. Print is far easier than TV online for various reasons, and the time period. Then make an appointment to see me for a tutorial. But I strongly recommend that. But try and do something a bit different. So I will give you credit for coming up with an idea that hasn't been done already. So Meghan Markle, Kate Middleton, it's been done a lot. What's been in the news this year? Black Lives Matter, COVID, American election. What else have we had? So something that's current, something that's present, something that's going on right now. Or surprise me, or go back to one of the ones that I've mentioned, nuclear weapons, royal family, things that aren't discussed. There's lots and lots of potential. So again, folks, apologies for racing through it, but let's just, has anybody got any immediate questions, comments, thoughts? Raise your hand, shout it out. We're all okay. So let's, last week what we did, we had a break at this stage, and then I said come back to the room, and if anybody had any thoughts or wanted to say anything. And I wasn't offended, but only 2 people came back, which is fine by me, but just be aware that from 12 until 1 I am available. So let's do this. Let's have a quick, literally 10-minute break. So if you have any questions, or if you want a tutorial or want to discuss anything, come back at 12:15 to this Zoom session. And if you want to go and do something else, that's fine. What I suggest, let me just leave you with this thought though, folks. What I suggest you do is that you start thinking about assessment 2. So see if you can write a draft version of 250 words about your reflections on what you've just heard for the last 2 hours. So just do it as a little sort of test, just to make sure that you're kind of following the brief. And if you want to send it to me, I don't usually do this, but I will give you some feedback on the draft. So think about 250 words on sociology of news. In what way did it challenge you, surprise you? How does it relate to the world? How does it relate to media studies, etc., etc. Okay, so let's meet back here in 10 minutes, 12:15. Like I said, not offended if you don't come back. If you want to email me, I will answer it this afternoon. The video will be up on Sunday. The PowerPoint you've got. Hopefully it was stimulating, interesting, and apologies for speaking too quickly, but the clock was ticking. Okay, so any more questions before I go? I don't think anybody's got their hand up. No. Okay, so hopefully see some of you back in 10 minutes. If not, have a good weekend, and see you all soon.